everyone. One of the main reasons I really like Lightning Talk evenings is because you get such a variety of talks. So we've had like infrastructure stuff and no code, and now I'm going to talk about CSS. So if anyone's really into PHP, sorry. Yeah. Okay, cool. So I haven't got a slide that introduces myself, but I know like most of you anyway, I think. So, but my name's Mike. I run IO Academy. We're a bootcamp in Bath. I taught like 50% of you to code, so it's fine. I'm going to talk about improving render performance. So let's talk about what that is. Render is what happens after your browser has downloaded the HTML and CSS. It then like reads the code, it parses it, and then it has to kind of convert it from that text that you wrote into the pretty thing that your users see. We call that rendering or painting, and that process can be slow depending on what you've written. And there are ways that we can improve that performance. So I'm going to talk about how you can do that. I've got 10 kind of tips of things that will help improve the performance. They're numbered, but they're not in an order that you should apply them. So they're just kind of random tips that I picked up. Okay, so number one, mobile versus desktop first CSS. So your the default CSS that applies when you load your page that's not inside a media query will always render first, right? Because it's going to render that CSS and then apply the media queries over the top if they're applicable. So you need to think about the majority of your users, what device they're likely to be on, right? If most people are on a desktop, then you should be writing a desktop first approach. Hopefully everyone's kind of already doing that anyway, but there's a bit of a trend to like mobile first being better, but actually that will can have quite a significant impact on how fast your application can render. So I wouldn't suggest picking mobile or desktop first. I would suggest thinking about how your users or who your users are and what devices they're likely to be using. In addition, you need to be thinking about how many breakpoints you've got, and that means both like literally how many media queries you've got in your CSS, and how many of those media queries have different comparisons in them. You see a lot of people writing CSS where they've got the same breakpoint media query, but like multiple times just spread out through the CSS so that it's in the right place in their CSS. But if you've got the same breakpoint 50 times, that's actually going to be way slower than if you just bulk them all together. So I'd suggest kind of grouping things as much as possible and try and reduce the amount of breakpoints you've got. 3 or 4 breakpoints generally should be enough. If you need more than that, talk to your designer because yeah, it's going to slow it down. Okay, cool. That was number one. Number two. Reducing repaints. So paints are renders. Basically, it's when the browser updates what you as a user can see. This maximum generally on a browser these days, most browsers can do one paint roughly every 16 milliseconds. And so in order to get like smooth transitions and animations and things, you need to make sure that the performance of your render or the performance of your paint can happen in less than 16 milliseconds, otherwise it starts to get laggy, right? And things start to slow down and your animations look rubbish. Or like when you scroll, it kind of jumps and things move around. There are certain CSS properties that force a repaint. So as the browser is rendering down the page, when it hits certain CSS properties, at that point in time, the whole page will then just start re-rendering from the top again because it's kind of got to recalculate all of the previous values, which if your render takes 1 millisecond to get halfway and then it's got to start again, it's now going to take 2 milliseconds just because you use that one CSS property. So unfortunately, some of these CSS properties you really can't avoid using, like grid and flexbox. Probably don't not use those. But some of the ones like transform, you can think about whether you actually need it, particularly near the bottom of your page. If it's like the last thing on your page, then you've just doubled the time of your render by putting a transform just at the bottom of your page because it's going to re-render the entire page. Just because you use the transform. This does vary between browsers. Certain browsers do this slightly differently. So there's kind of no silver bullet, if you like. But generally, these are kind of the list. The actual list is much longer if you look at all browsers, but these ones are the ones that most browsers will force a repaint as soon as they hit that property. so kind of reducing these as much as possible is good, except probably Flexbox. Okay, number 3, simplifying your HTML structure. I feel like this one's really obvious. Like, you should just do this as good code, but just generally avoiding unnecessary HTML, unnecessary nesting. Obviously, the more HTML you write, the longer it takes to parse, and therefore the longer it takes to render. I bring this one up particularly because there's a lot of frameworks and libraries and things out there that just have really poor HTML or enforce really poor HTML structures on you. Bootstrap is really bad for this. You have to have like 1 million divs to build your grid systems in that. But there are, you know, other libraries, other very common libraries that you'll use, and particularly JavaScript ones that like inject stuff into your page, and then there's just like 1 million divs that they've injected to create their fancy thing. But actually, that can have a really significant impact on how quickly your page can render. I would also pay attention to SVGs. If you're using SVGs that are coming from your designers, if you're actually embedding the SVG code into your page, if those SVGs have come out of like Illustrator, InDesign, those kind of places, those tools do not make performant SVGs, and yeah, those HTML structures will be awful. And actually, quite often you can rewrite those SVGs in code yourself that would be significantly more performant just by simplifying the structures. Yeah, so that's definitely one to watch out for. Okay, I've called this modern layout techniques, but I don't know how modern these things are, but basically just don't use floats, right? Hopefully not very many people are anymore, but it's weirdly common in companies that I talk to. For those of you that don't know, float is like a hack that we used to use to put things next to each other. Yeah, you're all old, you get it. Cool. But because it's a hack, actually it's really not a good way of putting things next to each other, and browsers are really bad at putting things next to each other with floats, and it's really slow. So despite the fact that Flexbox and Grid will force a repaint, it's still going to be quicker than what the browser has to do in order to figure out how things float next to each other, because float's just a weird property. So just generally avoid using that. The same with inline block. It's less bad than float, but still much worse than using Flexbox or Grid, because it has to do some weird calculations where it like merges inline and block, and there's all sorts of craziness that goes on. So just stick to Flexbox and Grid. Generally, the advice is to use Flexbox for like your components, so your navigation bar, your header, your footer. You know, each individual component itself should be built with Flexbox. The overall page layout is what Grid could be good for if you need something to set up your grid. Generally, if you can get away with just not having to set up something on your page layout and relying on the defaults, then do. But if you do, then Grid's the way to go. Okay, cool. I'm going to keep going. Right, number 5. CSS Selectors. This one really annoys me, mostly because half my students who are here are awful at this. You know who you are. So reduce the length of your CSS selectors. This one comes up quite a lot if you're using frameworks like Bootstrap and you're trying to override those frameworks and you end up writing like a really long CSS selectors. Don't do this. Really long CSS selectors are bad. The shorter your selector, the faster the browser can apply that selector, and therefore the faster it's going to render. Funnily enough, IDs are the quickest selector because they're unique elements, of course. It's going to be able to apply that to your HTML much faster, but you have to be careful because there's like all sorts of horrible precedence issues with IDs, and they're obviously unique elements, so they're not very reusable, which is rubbish. But if you can use an ID, then it will be the fastest thing to apply CSS with. These things, I haven't got a pointer thing, but like the plus, greater than, and tilde symbols, the CSS selectors that are HTML structure dependent are really quite bad. You should probably be avoiding using those anyway to write good CSS, but they're really bad for render performance because your HTML can change, and so what the renderer is having to do when you use those is essentially monitor your HTML and make sure it's not changing on every repaint, because if it does, then everything changes, which otherwise it wouldn't have to do if you don't use those selectors. So don't use those, just use classes. And the same with these, the attribute selectors. They're just really slow when you use the square brackets. See that kind of thing quite often with inputs, where you want to target a certain type of input. Just put a class on all those types of inputs and target the class instead, because these are really slow. Yeah. Cool, good. Next one. I've put Google fonts on this one, but it doesn't have to be specifically Google. This is just external fonts. So obviously, generally, good practice is limiting how many external fonts you're using. But actually, with the reason that I've put Google fonts is because there's this really cool feature which very few people I talk to know about, which is that with Google Fonts you can actually tell it which specific characters you want to load in. So rather than loading in the entire font face, you can just load in the characters that you need. So if you're using a font for like a title or a logo or something like that, don't load the entire font family in, because you'll get all the punctuation and every character that you don't need. You can just do this. So on the end of your href tag, you can just put text equals and then the letters or the characters that you need, and it will just load those in. And this will make a huge difference to how fast that font will load in, because these are really slow to load in. Notice that I've used the word example because I've got a capital and a lowercase e, because they are different characters. So you have to specify that you need upper and lowercase characters when you're doing that. If you just wrote just the letters you think you need, and you'll find that things just won't work and you get like weird characters coming out if you haven't loaded the bits you need. Cool, good. Number 7. Let's avoid or reduce how much slow CSS that we write. So there are certain CSS properties that are harder to render than others. Some of them you can't avoid, but the ones here generally you can. So things like border radius, basically anything that requires layers or semi-transparency or opacity or gradient is generally kind of the rule of thumb. So border radius is obviously the rounded corners you can put on stuff. Because everything is a box, it doesn't like rounding things, so that takes some time. Box shadow is obviously gradiented colors with transparency, as is opacity and filter. All of that is quite slow for the browser to render it, just for it to kind of generate that image essentially takes some time. And asking it to regenerate that image every 16 milliseconds can cause lag and jumps and things, particularly when you're scrolling and things just don't look quite smooth. And the same with transform. So filter and transform allow you to do all sorts of really cool stuff, but they're the least performant CSS that you can write, and are generally the biggest culprits for things looking a bit janky when you're scrolling or when things are animating. Finally, using calc. The CSS thing, calc, to calculate values. I see a lot of people just being lazy and being like, oh yeah, this is 100 minus 6. Like, just put this 94, right? Do the maths. It's not hard. Yeah, you know who you are. Yeah, so don't use calc unless you need to. Obviously, if you're doing like ems minus pixels or something like that, that's fine. But yeah, the less you can use calc, the better, because you're just making the browser do more work for you. Number 8, animation optimization. So I've talked about animations at various times. There are certain properties, like I said, like opacity, transforms, and gradients, which are much harder to animate. Trying to move something that's layered and gradiented to opaque is, yeah, much harder for the browser to do. But actually you can, this is a really good trick that I don't think many people know about. So if you're applying an animation to an element where that element animates but not on page load, so like on a user interaction or after a timeout or something like that, then you can use this thing called will change, and just specify the properties that are going to change, which things are going to animate when that thing changes, and the browser will essentially optimize that element and make the animation smoother. There's basically no downside to this. It slightly slows down the initial render, but it will make the animation much, much smoother. So if you're getting like janky animations, or particularly when you're scrolling, the animations don't really go properly, this is probably the solution, but it will slow down the initial render of the page because nothing's animating at that point, and it has to optimize the things that aren't animating. So for that reason, I would recommend only using this if you've actually got slow animations, right? If everything's working fine, then don't bother, because all you're doing is slowing down your initial render for no reason. But if you have got kind of laggy animations, then apply this and it'll probably fix it. Yeah. Cool, good. Number 9, focus on the fold. So the fold is what you see when you first load the page before you start scrolling. So it's everything above where the bottom of your browser is before you scroll down. So when your browser downloads your HTML, it hits a CSS link tag. The CSS link tags block the rendering, they block the parsing and the rendering of your HTML until it's downloaded and passed the CSS. It will then continue. So if you download the CSS for your entire application, whilst it's doing that, none of your HTML is downloading or parsing or rendering, so you're going to get kind of a little bit of lag before the user sees anything. So this is really quite serious optimization, but what you can do is split your CSS so that you've just got the CSS that applies to the HTML that's above the fold for the initial page load, and then put the rest of your CSS for everything else, things like your footer CSS, for example, put that in a different file and load it further down the page. That way, all of your HTML and your CSS is going to load much faster for what the user sees initially, and then when they by the time that they get to actually scrolling, it will have downloaded and rendered the rest of the page anyway. Because the way that browsers work these days, they render things as they go rather than waiting and just splatting the whole thing out. So they'll get the above the fold stuff much faster. The problem with this is that there's no like good automation tools for splitting your CSS for what CSS applies for above the fold and what doesn't. So you have to kind of do it manually and just split it into two CSS files, which is really not like obvious as to where to find. It's not maintainable CSS. Like this is above the fold CSS is a bit weird, but it will make quite a difference if you're getting slow initial renders. The other thing to do is to use this thing called content visibility, set it to auto. It's relatively new. It's not supported in all browsers yet, Chrome, Edge, and Opera. And basically it tells the browser to skip rendering an element until that element is visible. So the way that browsers currently render elements without this is even if it's set to display none or if it's below the fold, it will render the element anyway. So it's still done all of the work of loading, parsing in the HTML and actually displaying it on the page even if it's invisible. Whereas if you set it to content visibility auto, you can do this to like all elements if you wanted to. You could just put it on the asterisk selector. It just won't bother actually going through the action of rendering that element until that element is supposed to be visible. This is a particularly good one for any elements that appear like modal pop-ups, that kind of thing, because they are being rendered by the browser, even though they may never be displayed depending on what the user clicks. So if you've actually got those modals like embedded in your HTML rather than being loaded in by a JavaScript, then this is kind of really, I don't want to say vital, but like it will make a difference particularly if you've got loads of them. And there's just no negative impact to it. It doesn't, like if the browser doesn't support it, then the browser will just ignore it. So there's kind of no reason not to just use this all the time. Cool, good. Number 10, probably don't do any of the previous 9 points before you've done all the normal optimization ones. So all of those were very specific optimization things, but actually if you've got render performance issues, the first thing that you should do is optimize your images. Google created an app called Squoosh, which I mostly love because of the name of it. But you can just drag an image into it and it will download, like it saves like 85% of your download of your file size on images with basically losing no quality. It's a really good app. And you can actually, there's a Webpack and a grunt and a gulp automation thing that will do it for you. And you just say like, here's a folder of images, and it will just spit all them back at you, but much smaller, which is great. So yeah, do that first. Obviously reduce your HTTP requests. The fewer of them you've got, the better. And do all the caching. This is a lightning talk. I haven't got time to talk about all of those things, but do all of those things first. And then if you've still got problems, do the other 9 things. Yeah. And if you've still got problems after all of that, then pay for my LinkedIn learning course. Because, yeah, good. That'll help. Nice. And I'm done. Thank you very much.